When is one time you felt genuine 100% fear? I was flying an airliner. We were maybe 1,000 above ground while on approach to land at a smaller airport. There were thunderstorms in the area, and we ended up in a microburst with zero visibility. We got a wind shear warning in the cockpit and started to go around. At full throttle and the nose up, we were still sinking at around 400 feet per minute. Everything seemed to be running in slow motion. Both me and the other pilot were running through our required actions and callouts due to the training. In the back of my mind, all I could think about was I can't see the ground and we're falling. I know there's a hill out here somewhere. This is where I'm going to die. The plane got down to around 400 feet off the ground before it finally started to climb. This was the most fear I'd ever felt in my life. Yeah, flight, being in the air with zero visibility, very rational fear. You don't know which way's up, which way's down. I mean, you got like radar and stuff like that if you're the pilot in this situation, but man, just not knowing that you could collide with something at any given second because you have zero visibility, that definitely is fear-inducing. Story 2. The time I got into bed with my girlfriend and immediately started coughing up blood. Ran into the bathroom and held onto the sink for dear life. Every breath I tried to take, I just ended up wheezing more blood out of my lungs. By the time the ambulance got there, I had pretty much come to terms that this was how I died. Then it slowed down and finally stopped by the time I got to the ER. Long story short, it turned out to be Hodgkin's lymphoma. Had chemo for 6 months and am cured now with minimal repercussions. Scariest time of my life. Story 4. I was riding my bike home from work along a pretty busy main road. I live in the city. I got to a downhill and started to pick up pace when I noticed a brown snake, which are very deadly, lying across the bike lane just ahead of me. There was a car in the lane next to me and it was too late to stop, but I somehow managed to dodge the snake and kept going. About 50 meters later, just as I thought I was safe, I heard a very loud hissing and felt something rush past my leg and thought the snake had somehow caught up and bitten me. Turns out my back tire burst, but in the moment, I was absolutely terrified. Story 5. I got alcohol poisoning, and it didn't hit till I was on a train. I had gone to the train bathroom to throw up, but I was dry heaving and I didn't have water, and I could feel myself starting to black out. I was so effed up I couldn't even see straight enough to figure out how to open the door, and I started to think, oh my god, I'm gonna die in a train bathroom with my skirt hiked up. They're going to take pictures of this. Oh my god, people are going to see me like this. It was the most afraid for my life I've ever been. Not because I was going to die, but because I was going to die alone, in a train bathroom, because I was too stupid to stop doing shots. As I started to see spots, someone grabbed me by the hair, forced a water bottle between my lips, and was like, swallow, and I did, and I puked. And I did again, and I puked. And he got another bottle and did the same. And we went like that until I held down a few sips, and blood started flowing to my head again. He got off at my stop and walked me home, waited while I threw up a couple times, and made sure my boyfriend was there to take care of me when I got home. The whole time, he was just bickering at me, just non-stop of, do you understand how much of a burden you've put on other people? I'm gonna be 3 hours late getting home because I missed my stop making sure you're all right. This is irresponsible. You need to take better care of yourself and learn your limits, and for F's sake, if you're going to do that, at least wear pants. Just non-stop. He was right, on all counts, of course. That's what I love about Boston. People are a-holes, all of them, but they're a-holes that look out for one another. Yeah, I would also find appreciation in being scolded by this man. Look, if you can't take getting hit in the face with some truth bombs every now and then, you're definitely part of the problem. This guy's not being mean, he's just being real, and he still helped her out, so bravo, love it. Story 6. When my mom and then 5-year-old brother got into an ATV accident, they were driving slow through the woods, and a large, dead tree fell alongside the trail, knocking down a smaller tree, which hit them both in the head. Freak accident. My older brother and I were outside filling the pool, and we heard my mom yelling something. I didn't know what it was, but my stomach dropped. We both ran to the head of the trail across the yard, and she was carrying my little brother, both covered in blood. She ran half of that mile-long trail carrying him. They were both in the hospital for a week. Mom got some stitches in her face, and my brother's skull was shattered, requiring surgery and a metal plate put in. He's graduating high school next year and doing well. Story 7. My former college roommate slash current best friend and I are avid hikers and like to do the more difficult hikes in the greater tri-state area. New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, for those not in the know. We were doing our second trip up Mount Tammany, which is a rather steep and strenuous hike up a mountain with a great view of the Delaware River right on the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. After the difficult climb to the top, it's a slow and steady walk back down to the trailhead that passes by this lovely creek. We were around a mile away from getting back to the car and a few hundred feet away from the nearest other hiker, and we heard a loud crack out in front of us. It sounded just like a gunshot. This is the week of one of several large mass shootings in the US that year, so we exchanged a nervous laugh and kept walking forward. We go another 30 yards or so before we heard it again. This time, a rapid fire. Crack, 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 and I felt pieces of wood hit my face. I froze in fear at that moment, thinking some crazy mother effer brought an AR-15 to this fairly well-traveled hiking trail and is going to Viet Cong on us. Then my friend points to my left to this giant pine tree. It had rained a F-ton that spring/summer, and the outcrop of the tree decided to make its home had eroded away too much to support the weight of the tree. So the tree had started to lean, then buckle under its own weight right down the middle. We stood there watching as large cracks formed at the base of the tree. A crowd had started to form, watching it all go down with us. Eventually, gravity won the day, and the crowd of about 20 hikers and us watched as this 100-foot tree crashed down into and over the creek to our left. Luckily, no one was hurt since it fell away from the trail. But before I knew that it was a tree succumbing to gravity, I for certain thought we were going to be victims of a woodland mass shooting. Story 8. The morning of my mom's wedding. Everyone relaxing, eating breakfast, clothes everywhere, cousins running around. All of the adults are on their porch chilling. I hear my daughter screaming. I run in the dining room. There were clothes draped over the back of a dining room chair. The clothes had a metal coat hanger on them. She had gotten the hook of the metal hanger under her eyelid. I grabbed the back of her head and slowly pulled the hook out. Put a little ice on her eye for a bit. Luckily, it hadn't hit her eyeball at all. Story 9. I used to measure roofs for a solar company. One time, I went up on a very steep roof of a 2-story house alone, and without a harness. This roof plane was so steep to walk, and the shingles were old and crumbling, so I had to crawl so I didn't slide down towards the edge. After about an hour of crawling around, the sun began to bake the shingles so they were too hot to touch, so I decided to bug out. As the roof was too steep to walk, the only way to the ladder was by scooting on my butt with my feet pointed towards the edge. Every time I'd skid towards the edge, my heart exploded in fear because it was hard to stop from moving. I had to use my hands to slow myself down, and they were getting burned. All I could do was rub my palms on my legs to transfer some of the heat, but they were being scorched. Imagine putting your hand on a hot frying pan full of grit. I was completely alone in a faraway town with no one to call. It took forever to get to the ladder, and by the time I did, I was shaking and drenched in sweat. When I finally got back to the ground, some people came out of a nearby house and said they saw me and were ready to call 911. I had burn blisters on both palms, and I never went on a roof like that again without a helper or PPE. Story 10. It was 5 years ago, almost to the day. I was home with my 2 daughters, who at the time were 3 and just over 1. I was giving them a bath, kneeling on the ground, and all of a sudden, it felt like something exploded in my heart. I remember thinking, just get the kids out of the water. Nothing else matters. I got them out of the water and was able to call an ambulance. I was taken to the hospital, and long story short, I had blood clots in both lungs and my right knee. They think a piece of the knee blood clot broke free and passed through my heart. I'm very lucky to be alive and so grateful I was able to get my daughters out of the tub. I found out I have multiple blood clotting disorders and am on blood thinners for life, but I'm alive. Story 11. My first time doing truffles. We were in our hotel room, plus another friend who was in Amsterdam with us at the time, for a total of 3 guys. I was just hanging out, being a jolly idiot in the bathroom, looking at the tiles. Walk back into the bedroom and friend 1 is in a fetal position staring at our wide open window. We're on the top floor, so pretty high up. I can't see friend 2 anywhere, so I ask after him, only to get a 1,000-yard stare and the answer he went out. I say I didn't hear the door when I was in the bathroom. He didn't go out the door, said friend 1. So I sidle my way over to the window and can't see anything. I'm absolutely freaking out. All of the thoughts about what we're going to have to tell his family, what do we do, etc., etc. I sit down on the bed next to friend 1 and just went cold. Then friend 2 just slumps out of where he was, being an idiot curled up in the wardrobe of the room. I don't think I've ever cried in relief before that or since. Story 12. I've posted this before, but anyway, buckle up, it's a long one. We used to go sailing in the BVIs for summer holidays when I was younger. One evening, we were anchored in a bay with a party boat of teenage Americans nearby. After some alcohol, starting a water fight seemed like a great idea. At some point during the ensuing chaos, I ended up kidnapped and held as a hostage on their tender, little motorboat for getting from sailboat to shore. They decided to drive me out to sea, and once we were thoroughly out of the bay, they started joking about tossing me overboard. Drunk me is not smart. Drunk me thought the best response to this joke threat was to stand up and yell, "You can't throw me overboard if I jump out," which I promptly did. They laughed and drove off. I was left floating in the middle of the sea about a half-mile from shore in the pitch black. At first, the alcohol stopped me from panicking, and I decided to just swim back. Half a mile isn't that bad, right? Now my brain was beginning to wonder what was swimming around beneath me, but I was mostly calm until something bounced off my leg. This is the point at which I need to introduce you to the villain of this story. You see, usually the BVIs have lovely, safe, clear waters. However, once every 4 to 5 years, they get unusually high numbers of moon jellyfish. Of course, moons aren't scary at all. They rarely sting, and when they do, it's not even as painful as a nettle sting. They really weren't the problem. It was the creature that used them as a food source that was the danger. Known colloquially as the stinging cauliflower, they were purple balls of pure evil. In our marine life books, they were the only jellyfish that got the same danger/pain rating as the man-o-war jellyfish. Earlier that day, a young girl from another boat got stung while playing on the beach. We heard her scream from about a quarter of a mile out the bay at anchor. She went into anaphylactic shock and almost died. Side story, the vinegar and talcum powder we had stocked for jellyfish stings apparently saved her life, according to the emergency responders, because we zoomed it over when we heard the mayday on the radio. Anyway, back to the story. There I was, half a mile out from shore in the pitch black with no idea these kids were going to come back and get me, or if they would even be able to find me again in the dark, since I had no idea if I was drifting with any current. A moon jellyfish had just bounced off my leg, and where there are moons, there are always cauliflowers. I was pretty certain if I swam into one and got stung, chances are I wouldn't be able to stay afloat and I would drown. I start to feel genuinely sick and scared, struggle to keep my breathing under control, etc. But there's nothing to do except hope to high heaven I don't hit one. So that's what I did. It was over 15 minutes before the crapheads came back to get me. By this point, the panic and swimming had turned my muscles to jelly, and they had to literally haul me back into the boat. I never told my family or friends on the holiday. Didn't want to ruin their fun. I just quietly told folks I was tired and went to bed. To this day, I can still taste the salt in my mouth and feel my heart rate and breathing increase whenever I tell that story. TLDR, I'm a stupid drunk and jumped in jellyfish-infested water in the middle of the night and got left there and tried to swim back. I'm lucky I'm not dead. Story 13. When I was alone in my house and I heard something call my name. It was probably some weird bird or something outside, but I was 11 and dumb, so I was terrified. Story 14. A few years back, I was in a toxic relationship with an individual suffering from several mental illness. He refused to take medications. I had not a clue how bad it had gotten until he was driving us back to our apartment. He started rambling about how God chose him to save my soul and I was a fallen angel. He would send me back to heaven. He floored the gas on a short dead-end road and almost drove into a cement wall. I remember briefly wondering if I should jump out of the car at 50 mph or stay in and pray the airbag saved me. He slammed the brake last minute as I was about to open the door and jump. Absolute fear. I ended up hospitalized a few days later to other crappy relationship-related events and never saw him again. Hands down, one of the more terrifying moments of my life, but not the only one I experienced by being with him. Story 15. I was sitting in the waiting room of the ICU talking to my aunt. My dad has just been moved from the ER to the ICU that morning. My mom was with him, but I had to go to the waiting room while they got him settled in. All of a sudden, I hear, "Code Blue in ICU room XYZ." I didn't even know what his room was, but I just had this terrible feeling. My entire body goes numb. I look at my aunt and say, "I'm going back there." As soon as I open the ICU ward door, a nurse looks at me and says, "Are you the daughter of so-and-so?" with a very empathetic look on her face. And I say, "Yes. Oh my God, is that my dad? Is that my dad coding?" She says, "Come with me." We sprint down the hall to the back of the ICU, and I turn the corner to see a room full of people. My mom is standing in the corner, in complete shock. My 100% genuine fear? Standing in the corner of the ER watching nurses perform CPR on my dad for 17 minutes. CPR is nothing like you see on TV. Any medical professional will agree with me. It's violent and intense. There were about 15 people in the room, and it is intense, organized chaos. It's one of the worst memories I have, but talking about it somewhat helps. I miss you, Dad. Story 17. When I was still a beginning driver, I basically misjudged a turn at a highway exit when it was raining. My car swiveled and turned around. Somehow I managed to get it to stop, but I ended up bumping the side railing with the back of my car, and the car turning more than 180 degrees on the road before coming to a halt. This is a very busy exit, and if someone had been right behind me, I'd have been dead. Somehow, I managed to gather my wits, restart the car, turn it around, and drive off before another car hit me. I stopped at the earliest possible parking opportunity, and that was when I felt it, the fear. I just started shaking uncontrollably. Story 18. My wife and son were out of town, so I had the house to myself. I used that opportunity to do something I never get to do, have a shower with the washroom door open. Small things like that make me happy. Anyway, I was just getting out of the shower when, without a sound, I see someone's head slowly go by in the dark corridor outside the washroom door. I nearly shat myself in terror. The doors were all locked. How did anyone get in? And there was something unnatural and menacing about that slow, silent glide by the door. Like they must have known I was there, but they just didn't care. Plus, whoever it was really tall. The head was 7 feet off the ground. My heart raced so fast, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Wet and terrified, I peered out of the door to find the mystery solved. The head was my son's helium balloon toy, partly deflated over time, floating by on the slight air current. In short, I had nearly been frightened to death by my kid's toy. Not my proudest moment. So, story aside, I am very satisfied to know that I'm not the only one that showers with the bathroom door open when no one else is home. That's funny. Story 19. I was in labor with my son, and my blood pressure kept bottoming out. First, I lost my vision. It came back. Then, I lost my hearing. While I was unable to hear, all the medical staff in the room suddenly had very concerned looks on their faces and rushed to the monitor tracking my baby's heartbeat. I then started to pass out, and as I was losing consciousness, I saw a nurse thrust an injection into my leg, but I felt nothing because of the epidural. All of that combined was probably the scariest moments of my life. Both my son and I were okay, and he's a healthy 1-year-old now. Story 20. My SO was in kind of a slump emotionally for a bit, and while I was at work, he texted me and seemed pretty down. I asked him what was up, and he didn't respond. I tried calling, but he denied my calls. Then suddenly he just wrote, "I don't feel too good mentally," and just went offline on all platforms at once and shut off his phone. I just slammed my work laptop shut and ran as fast as I could to the subway to get home. When I finally reached the apartment, he wasn't even there. I was so freaked out. I was just screaming his name like a madwoman, somehow hoping he'd respond. Everything turned out just fine in the end, and he apologized for scaring me, but oh man, I was so sure I was going to be the one to find his body that day. Story 21. I came home on my lunch break to check on my ill 12-year-old. My abusive ex-husband's car is in my driveway. I had previous restraining orders against him, expired, but divorce decree states he was not allowed in my home for any reason. Clearly, he was there also checking in on our child. Child was fine, by the way. He just had a sinus infection. So I rationally entered my own home. This surprised my ex, and he yelled, "What the F are you doing here?" I calmly replied, because I live here and I'm checking on Mike. The bigger question is, what are you doing in my house? There's a legal order of protection against you. He yelled again, "My God, I hate you. I'm gonna effing kill you." And he pushed me as he ran to his car. We're both avid gun owners. Sport, protection, concealed, carry certified, hunting, the whole 9 yards. Is he going to his car for his gun? How is my son? What was he doing inside my house? Lock the door and check it all out. Son is fine. Nothing is out of order. Okay, fine. Bam! Bam, 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 bam! X is pounding on the front door, demanding my son leave with him. Well, crap. Either this is just kinda effed up, or this is when an abusive man breaks and actually kills a woman he hates the most. Obviously, I survived. TLDR, ex-husband threatened to kill me in my own home. He pled no contest to disorderly conduct and was on probation for a year. Did community service and paid a fine. I spent more time and money on therapy for that. Story 22. I'm from the Dominican Republic. There are a lot of dogs in the streets, and they usually hang in these colmados, mini market. that are in pretty much every neighborhood. My parents would send me to buy stuff almost every weekend, and the dogs would chase me a lot of the time since the colmados sell over the counter. I would have to buy whatever it was and try to not let the dogs see me, and if they saw me, I had to run uphill while being chased by 5 dogs. That was not fun. Edit. I've lived in that neighborhood for 6 years, and for 5 of them, it was the same dog gang every time. They got old and died. Story 23. Somehow, hearing knocking through my sound-canceling headphones. It wasn't coming from my headset, it was coming from my front door, and no one was there, so I just went back to playing. Heard it again, and I decided to watch the door for the rest of the day. I'm still confused to this day on how there was a loud enough sound to go through the headset. Not sure if I was just crazy or whatever else it could have been. Story 24. When I was woken up by my dogs going nuts and found out my house was on fire. By the time I had woken up, the stairs were engulfed in flames. I truly lost all sense of what to do. Thought it was all over. Eventually got to a window and ended up throwing my dogs out the window. All were okay, and jumping out the window. I never would wish that feeling on anybody. Story 25. Excuse the lengthy paragraph that's going to follow. I'll try to make it as short as possible. I was going to enter year 11 that year, so I was about 15 years old. I needed to walk to school to register and decided I'd take a shortcut. That street was long, with trees on each side and nobody around, but when I realized my mistake, I was already halfway through it, so I figured I'd continue on my way. At some point, I heard footsteps behind me and turned around. There was a man who had something weird about his demeanor, and I remember immediately feeling it. So I gradually picked up the pace, but he just bolted and got to me, knife in hand. Asked me to give him my phone, which I should have done. That was my first phone, and as a stupid teenager with no money, I sort of thought it'd be a good idea to negotiate so he doesn't take my phone. Dumb idea, cause he asked me to follow him while still pressing the knife against my back, acting like he was just casually holding me. Now, I lived in a small town at the time, so I had to walk 10 minutes like that before finding a police officer to alert. Started screaming, crying, until people eventually surrounded the guy and dragged me out of there. I was informed by a police officer that the man was actually a SAer who had escaped prison months ago. Felt lucky to have escaped that one. Story 26. A few years ago, I was trying to find gas in the middle of nowhere. I found a gas station but couldn't get the pump to work. A guy pulled up and told me that they wouldn't work because it was after 8 p.m. He said he had a few gallons in his truck and offered. I offered him cash and he declined. He was nice and respectful until he began slowly pumping the slowest 2 gallons of my life. Then he started saying in a creepy, though almost angry, between clenched teeth voice, "You look really good. You married?" The complete change in demeanor and tone of voice scared the absolute crap out of me. It sent a chill through my body. I was absolutely terrified. Even if I'd had a weapon, he could have overtaken me. There was not a soul around, and the pasture around us was at least 2 to 3 feet of grass. I knew I was a goner. He kept saying lewd things, then asking where I worked and lived until I took the F off. Story 27. Hemorrhaging after giving birth to my second child. My epidural finally wore off and I was being escorted to the restroom. When I sat up in bed, I felt a huge gush of fluid and thought, oh, probably just peed since my bladder is still a little numb. Got to the restroom, pulled down the mesh underpants, and blood dumped on the floor. When I sat on the toilet, a massive flood of fist-sized or larger blood clots and blood left my body. I immediately felt faint, and my nurse could tell. She looked at the mess and called for the hemorrhage response team to the room. I will never forget the look of dread on my husband's face when I left the bathroom with blood running down my legs. The helplessness I felt lying on that bed, with my newborn in sight, his father holding my hand for dear life, and dozens of nurses rushing to get different medications to inject me with, while a doctor scooped clots out of my body with his hands and a nurse pushed on my stomach, is something I'll never forget. Nor will I forget how heavy my chest felt with every breath, how dim everything appeared, or how hard it was to think. I never had a fear of blood, and now it paralyzes me. Yeah, I can't imagine what that would feel like, but I can totally get how now that's just something that's going to trigger you for life. That had to be absolutely traumatizing, not just for you, but for your entire family as well. But glad you're okay, and glad that the child's okay as well. Story 28. Driving to Alaska on the Alkin, came around a turn, and standing in the road was a mother brown bear and 2 cubs. I was in a 1980 Ford Courier pickup with the exterior body thickness of an aluminum can. I came to a quick halt as she faced the vehicle in a clearly protective stance. Unsure if backing up would set her off, I put it in R and sat unmoving for what felt like an eternity until the cubs ambled into the woods and she followed. Story 29. I was bullied really badly for all of 5th and 6th grade, and the teacher was even part of the bullying. My depression drove me to do things I never thought I would have done, and I was glad my parents didn't allow me to carry a crafting knife in my pencil case. But it also caused my grades to slip terribly. The teacher would constantly tell me how everything was my fault, insult me, and he'd always say middle school would be like this, but 10 times worse. I'd always been scared. The day I graduated, I broke down. Everyone was crying a bit because they were sad to leave friends, and they thought I was crying for the same reason, perhaps just more dramatically as I was about to move to another city. But I wasn't. It was the greatest fear I'd ever experienced because I literally thought I would die in middle school. Story 30. Really bad turbulence at high altitude, and a lady yelled through the plane's intercom something I couldn't understand, and then kept repeating, "Brace! Brace! Brace!" She kept doing so for a long while, and that plane shook in ways I didn't think possible. I and everyone awake at that moment about to crap our pants. To this day, I cannot experience turbulence without at least a minor degree of fear. Story 31. I remember watching something on YouTube, and all of a sudden, I had a weird blind spot in my eye. I have a fear of going blind as my eyesight is really bad. It's negative 7.5 and getting worse. I instantly started panicking, thinking I'm going blind, and ran to my mother, who took me to the doctors. Turns out I had an eye/retinal migraine. I had never heard of an eye migraine before this, but still, I went into instant panic mode. Story 32. I go back 8 years ago to me being very pregnant, 37 weeks, and getting a phone call from my dad at like 7 a.m. My mother is diabetic and wears a pump. She had been sick. We thought it was a stomach bug or maybe even the flu. Apparently, during the night, she woke up and was throwing up and somehow aspirated in her lungs. About an hour later, she woke my dad up and said something wasn't right. He, in turn, woke my brother up immediately, who carried her down the stairs and put her in the car and drove to the ER. They immediately realized she was going into DKA, and also couldn't breathe on her own, so they intubated her. It was a small hospital, and they decided to med flight her to a bigger, more capable one. I've never been so scared in my life, about to give birth to her first grandchild and could lose my mother. How was I ever going to be okay again? It was a very rough couple of weeks, but she did pull through and was by my side when I gave birth. She's my best friend in this world, someone who always has my back. Losing my parents is one of the scariest things to me. Story 33. When I was younger, around 15 to 16 maybe, I was home alone. We own a dog, so most noises you can just say, it was the dog. But that night, the dog was laying with me in the bed, and I heard a noise downstairs. Me, being the paranoid F I am already, had the baseball bat from my brother next to my bed. I grabbed it and went to the stairs, and I saw a light flashing by. It looked like a flashlight, so I grabbed the baseball bat tighter and had tears in my eyes, but I went downstairs. There was nothing. Everything was all right. It was my biggest fear, but at the same time, the biggest relief I've ever had. Still, I wonder where that light came from. A car would be impossible because the street is on the other side of the house and lights from the neighbors as well. So there's that. Story 34. Hiding in a dark mothball closet under the stairs, my mom whispering in my ear, "If he finds us here, he'll kill us." He was my raging, stalking stepdad. Being shot at by drunk, crazy rednecks. Being home alone and hearing the window in the next room slide up, and then confronting this wannabe burglar. And mice. Nearly everywhere I see one. Eek! Story 35. When I was 10 and my mother had a nervous breakdown, she spent the entire night hitting and kicking me while making me tell her I hated her. She's taken a break to cry in the bathroom, ordered my sibling and I pizza, but the breaks that night were short before it was back to the abuse. Honestly, that was one of the worst nights of my life, and even after years of therapy, I still have nightmares over that. I was seeing her expression change so rapidly, they got me, and how quickly she snapped. Story 36. Seeing my abuser from childhood again. Every time, he'd somehow weasel himself back in. Because my parents never knew what he did, and I saw his face, I would get this cold, nauseous and tight feeling inside, normally accompanied by being sick and locking myself in my room. Everyone assumed I was just an antisocial kid, which was partially true, but being a CSA survivor who was repeatedly exposed to my abuser again and again sure didn't help. I was afraid to sleep without someone else in the room, refused to undress unless I was in a room with a door that could be locked, and avoided being in any space near him at all costs. That's fear. P.S. Came back to this after rest and was surprised to see how many people had similar, if not the same experience. While it's awful that so many people have had to go through what I did, if not worse, as a small child, it helps and really means a lot that so many people are more kind and understanding than I ever would have thought. Thank everyone for the kind words and support. You're appreciated. You are valid and you are loved. Never forget that. Story 37. I once woke up with my diaphragm cramped up and basically almost completely unable to breathe and with an unreasonable pain in my chest. I was cold as hell and sweating profusely. I could not stand up and every position hurt terribly. Lying on the side like a fetus hurt the least. I was sure I was going to die. After a few minutes of panic, though, I was sort of okay with it. The situation resolved itself in about 40 minutes, but they were not pleasant. 20 years later, I still remember the sensation. So this is probably a different thing. They're talking about pain in the diaphragm, but I've had 2 kidney stones before, and I remember the same thing. It's just like literally there's no relief, and it gets so painful that like you would rather die. So I totally get how that can break your mind. Story 38. The first time I heard a gunshot after surviving being shot in the face with a 9mm. It was over a year later. I heard the shot while talking to my BF and I immediately just stopped talking, turned around and bolted for his car. I got inside and started hyperventilating/crying. It took me quite a while to actually stop breathing so heavy, but he talked me through it and calmed me down. True fear, followed by intense embarrassment. Story 39. I was working out with a personal trainer, small gym, just for this kind of thing, and we were the only 2 in there. I finished a pretty rough circuit and he went to the restroom while I recovered. Then I started to feel a tightness in my chest and pain. I started clutching at my chest, thinking, no, not now, not like this, it's too soon. And then I let out the biggest, most powerful burp I've ever had, and immediately felt fine. I'd seen in sitcoms and such where a guy thinks he's having a heart attack and then gets diagnosed with gas, but now I fully understand it. Story 40. I've had quite a few run-ins with work-related incidents, from rigging failing with a dozen tons of steel overhead to being crushed by a machine with overridden safety interlocks. The ones that really spook me are rotating masses, though. Lathe crashes are just a matter of getting away from the chuck as fast as humanly possible and trying everything to stop the awful booming sounds. Well, if that wasn't enough, I picked up a job doing centrifuge repairs. After the better part of the year, I got tasked with rebuilding a horizontal centrifuge. Imagine a 55-gallon drum made of 1-inch thick steel spinning at 3,500 RPM plus. And after rebuilding, I started up and it reaches full speed. Then hell breaks loose, and there are solid carbide tiles inside this machine, and they all broke off in the span of 2 seconds. The machine started shaking like mad, and while I wanted to shut it off, I had to run behind the currently runaway machine that could rip itself apart to do so. That moment had me crouching and terrified as I made my way to the disconnect. Story 41. I got dengue twice, which is a painful virus in Southeast Asia. There are only 4 strands of dengue, and if you survive one, you're immune to that one for life. I survived the first one and was in my bed for 2 weeks. I felt paralyzed. I couldn't do anything. Using any technology gave me a headache. I recovered completely fine, and then a few months go by and I caught dengue twice. If you don't know, catching it multiple times is a lot more dangerous. I had internal bleeding, and my life was a misery. I was genuinely fearing. I obviously recovered, really well actually, better than most people. This time it took a month to recover. I ended up having vein issues in my left kidney and testicle, but I had to get surgery to cut those veins and basically force my body to use other passages. If you catch it, get medical help, and you will have a pretty good chance at recovery. However, the fever spikes you get from it are something different. If you're an active person, it'll take ages to get back into sports. Story 42. When I was around 14 years old, my friends and I were at a mall, and the mall went on lockdown because of an active shooter. Turns out it was just a guy shooting the air, but at the time we didn't know that. Everyone assumed the worst case scenario. It was really scary because for the first time in my life, it felt like there was a huge possibility I was going to die. Story 43. Last winter, I was in the back seat of a truck with my friends. I was in the middle seat, and like an idiot, I didn't use the seatbelt. We were driving on the highway and over a bridge. We hit ice. All of a sudden, we're skidding to the edge of the lane, and I see the 2-foot-tall cement wall on the edge getting closer, and we're about to slam into it. I knew we'd of course break it and go over, and I knew I was going to die. In .2 seconds, I thought, this is how I'll die. wonder if it'll hurt, if I'll die instantly, if I'll bleed out, if my friends will die around me. I knew I was going to die. And then we bounced off the wall, spun, hit it again, spun, and hit it a third time before stopping. The entire thing, from hitting the ice to stopping, took like half a second, but I knew I was going to die. Everyone was okay, surprisingly minimal damage to the truck, too. Story 44. When my son started choking, he was about 9 months old and was eating his standard wheat cereal with milk for breakfast and was happily munching away. Then, all of a sudden, he just stopped. He went silent, totally silent. There was no air moving. It was effing terrifying. Luckily, I've had children first aid training, and that and mom instinct kicked in. Slapped him hard on the back with his head pointing to the floor with him over my knee. Multiple slaps, clog of cereal dislodged, and he was able to breathe again. We both collapsed on the floor in tears, had cuddles, and generally recovered. Then he wanted to carry on eating his breakfast. He's a trooper. Story 45. Probably the time I had someone break into my house. At the time, it was just me and my mom living alone. For reference, my mom is 4'11" and around 90 pounds. It was a cool, calm night, and my mom had gone to bed hours earlier. The time was around 11:45 p.m. or so, and I was in my room watching TV. Then I hear the loudest bang and my house alarm goes off. Now, this wasn't the first time someone's tried to break in, but I can tell by the bang that someone actually got in this time. I grab my shotgun from the room and go and wake up my mom. I have her wait in the bedroom and I go to clear the house. I've never been more scared for my life than when I was clearing my house with no lights on and not knowing where this possibly crazed lunatic is. I finally clear the main floor and upstairs, and there's only one place remaining, the basement. The basement has wooden stairs and is unfinished, with very little light down there. I announce myself while trying to not sound afraid for my life, but to no avail. The fear comes out in my words, and it's obvious. I finally man up and creep down the loud stairs. As I finally make it to the end of the stairs, I'm faced with my wall with a path to the left or right. Either way, I felt like this was where I would get jumped. I take a few breaths and begin to clear the basement. As I clear my basement, heading towards the area where the noise came from, I don't find anything out of place. What I did find was a bird who had crashed into my window so hard it triggered the window sensor to claim it was broken into. Story 46. Last summer, I went to Albania on holiday. We were going to land in the hospital and then take buses out to some several thousand inhabitants village. A 4-hour bus ride, which is very long by European standards. That driver must have been part devil, because he drove like a proper maniac. For those of you who don't know, Albania is a mountainous country east across the water from Italy. Now, driving across mountain roads is probably never fun. Being driven across mountain roads is less fun. Being driven across mountain roads in the middle of June, very warm, is even less fun. Being driven across mountain roads in the middle of June when I'm Dutch, you know, the country that is notorious for being flat? Holy crap, I didn't know you could up and down that fast outside of elevators and roller coasters. But wait, it gets worse. Just that stuff would have made me supremely miserable and reconsider how often I call my mother. But this driver must have been driving at least 33% above the speed limit on average, while consistently passing other motorists, in the mountains, on crappy roads, in the middle of sharp mountain road turns. While he's supposed to stay on the inside, he willingly would swerve towards the edge just to be done a few minutes earlier. F. I spent approximately 3 hours of that trip slowly coming to terms with my death. I genuinely thought that this would be it. I couldn't communicate with the driver at all, so nothing I did would prevent it. At worst, I would cause the accident. If I had to die, I just hoped it'd be fast. So the first of the 3 terror hours was spent in absolute abject fear, the second in growing terror, and the third in a cold-blooded acceptance of death. Next time I'll rent a car. Thanks. Yep, I understand this fear as well, like when you're not behind the wheel and there's a crazy driver at the wheel. I think it just has something to do with like not being in control of the situation. You kind of feel at the mercy of the elements. So yeah, definitely been there, felt that as well. Story 47. That time when a guy stalked me. I was walking to my brother's house, headphones on, so at first I didn't notice him. He followed me for several minutes, then grabbed my shoulder and started yelling at me like a damn possessed. He was yelling that I was a whore, that people like me should die, and things like that. I was pretty sure he was going to beat me up, but after that, looked like hours of yelling, he released me. I ran like I've never ran before, straight to my brother's house, crying all the way. Story 48. Last night, I ordered takeaway at a restaurant and their parking lot was full. I drove around for 5 minutes and there wasn't a single parking spot within a quarter-mile radius of the restaurant. Since I was just picking up my food and leaving, I parked my car illegally in the restaurant's lot, leaving my hazards on. I had already paid on the app, so it could not have taken 3 minutes total for me to run in, grab my food, and return to my car being impounded. The two people were circling my car and told me that they were with the towing company across the street. They said they watched me circle around the block multiple times before illegally parking and immediately went to impound my car once they saw me park. I told them it was only a minute and I was super sorry. He said he didn't care. It's $125 to get my car back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., or $175 right now because of a late night fee. I said that I'm a student. I don't have $175 laying around, and I have work until 8 a.m. that I need my car to get to. They told me that they don't care and they were going to take my car across the street and to come back once I had the money. I apologized more. I offered to give them my meal, which they refused, and then we were all just standing there for a second. I noticed my car hadn't been booted or anything yet, so I unlocked it, got in, and left. Okay, I'm just hoping beyond hope that this story was posted for satire purposes, because otherwise there's a lot of stupidity going along in this tall tale. But let's just move on. Story 49. It's a pretty long one, but here we go. I was really hungry one night, so I decided to make pasta, and it was around 2 to 3 a.m., and I was minding my own business when I heard a knock on my garden window. I thought nothing of it because it was raining and it was noisy anyway, but then I look out of the window and I thought I saw a figure. I still didn't know what it was, but I turned the stove off, stopped grating my cheese, turned my kitchen light off, and went into the next room because I was petrified, of course. My house has an extension, which is in the back room, next to the kitchen, so I can see my garden window through a window in another room. So I closed the curtains, but I was so scared that I couldn't go upstairs to tell my mom because I was frozen. So I was talking to a friend on the phone, and she was panicking, telling me to shout for her, so I did. And all she replied with was, "Turn the garden light off." But the light switch is next to the back door, which is next to the window. So I said no, came downstairs, and she was pretty pissed off because it was a stupid hour of the morning, but when she came back, I was just stood in the same position I had been for about 10 minutes, and I was so scared I'd started crying. My mom asked me what was wrong, so I told her I heard a knock on the window and something in the garden moved. She told me that it was probably a cat, so she took me upstairs, and we heard noises coming from downstairs, and she told me to stay where I was. So I did, and I was crap scared. She came back up, and there was nothing there. Nothing in the garden or anywhere. And to this day, I hate being in my kitchen in the dark. Story 50. I think I felt that a couple of times so far. Here's one of those occasions. When I was about 10 years old on a normal school day, during the last hour, our teacher gets called outside the classroom by our principal. I remember seeing how worried the principal was. After a couple of minutes, the teacher came back, calmed us down, and told us very calmly, "There's a bomb outside the front door of the school." There was a silent panic that swept across the classroom as she proceeded to tell us to hide under our desks. She waited about an hour after the army and bomb diffuser team showed up. Then, one by one, the families came and picked up their children. I had to walk home alone. Story 51. Lost control of my car when I was going 80 on the highway. Some guy tried to rapidly merge in between me and the semi-truck in front of me, and I had to make a quick adjustment to keep from hitting him. My car started rapidly swerving as I tried to regain control. At some point, I realized I was going to crash, and there wasn't much I could do. The one thought going through my head was, "Don't hit the semi-truck, don't hit the semi-truck," over and over again. I couldn't stop the crash, but I managed to force my car to swerve into the concrete barrier, parallel parking style. No damage to the car, no one else involved. I was unhurt. I consider myself to be very lucky. Story 52. I was on a commercial flight, and the pilot came over the tannoy to tell us luck wasn't on our side today, and there was an emergency with the flaps and landing gear not working correctly, and that we would have to fly around to burn off the fuel. There would be lots of emergency vehicles to meet us when we did land, but not to worry too much, as he'd recently done this emergency in the simulator. Passengers were crying and panicking. No one felt reassured. I genuinely thought we were all going to die. Story 53. I was trapped in a house with a drunk friend and two men who clearly wanted to have sex with us and were trying their best to make me drink from a probably spiked glass. I was sober that night and could think straight, so I refused anything they were trying to give to me, and they looked extremely agitated at my refusal, but I was adamant on not taking any substances. It took me 2 hours to get out of there. When I forced my way out, they looked at me with the creepiest stare and said, quote, "You go, your friend stays." I can never forget how terrified I was. I later found out from my friend that they had tried their best to touch her and SA her, whilst I was trying to figure out how to get us out. I was away from her for 2 minutes. She had gone to the toilet. Story 54. I experienced a heart attack with the age of 21. I thought I'd die during the experience. The pressure and pain in the chest, the numbness of my arms. I puked and everything went dark. Figures I managed to get my heart infected. Everything swole up and I had water in my heart valves. Not native, excuse me if that's wrong. That's what caused it. I was 100% sure I was done shortly before I went out. I also was alone in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, preparing for a multiple-day jungle trek. I went to my B&B after getting dinner, and a guy pulled me into a small side street and showed me a knife and started to talk in Thai. As I started to unbuckle my backpack, some young guys came into the street and chased the effer off. They apparently saw what happened. I bought them drinks afterwards. David and friend, I'm still grateful if you ever read this. Edit. That's the second time I nearly got robbed while traveling, but I was alone that time, so it was more terrifying. Story 55. Back in '07, while in Iraq, we arrested the chief of police. He was giving weapons and information on us to local AQI, Al-Qaeda Iraq, as well as human trafficking, mostly children. After his arrest, the police station was emptied of all its weapons and every police officer left. Turns out, the Iraqi LT we left in charge also worked for AQI, and so did every effing cop there was. Now, 0 police in a city of 9,000. The first night patrol after that was probably the most scared I had been during that deployment. Spoilers. The next week was a series of standoffs, gunfights, hit and runs, and ambushes utilizing IEDs and rockets and small arms. For some reason that night, I kept singing to myself, F the police, F the police. So scared it made my balls hurt. Story 56. My wife and I get into a huge fight because she wanted me to quit soda and I refused. Then, after a bit of time, she wore me down and I promised her I would quit for good. Fast forward a few months later, and my wife is so happy that I quit. Thing is, I would run to the supermarket to grab a soda, sometimes before work. One day, we take my car to grab groceries for the house. As she jumps in next to me, I notice I left a Coke bottle in plain view in the front seat coaster. Yeah, out of all the stories we've read so far, I think that this would probably induce the most fear in me. Kidding, of course, but I love the light jab at humor there. Story 57. The night I thought my abusive ex-boyfriend was going to kill me, he had been drinking and screaming in my face, demanding I tell him where his gun was. I hid it before he got home, knowing he was intoxicated. Thankfully, the upstairs neighbors heard him screaming and throwing me around and called the cops who showed up before anything serious could happen. Story 58. I was hanging out at night in my fort with my friends in the South Jersey swamp as a young teen. Suddenly, the swamp went silent. It never goes silent. At night, it's loud, and only the things in your immediate vicinity shush as you pass. This was complete silence as far as we could hear. In the same instant, we looked at each other and just panicked. We were all filled with a sense of absolute terror. No words were spoken. We all just bolted back to the neighborhood as fast as we could. We never knew what happened. We never felt stupid about it either. We all know something was off, but to this day, over 40 years later, I've never felt fear or panic like that, and have never heard nature go silent again either. Story 59. It was around 2 a.m. almost exactly 2 years ago. I was awoke by a sound that I can only describe as gasping for air to no avail. I looked to my left to see my wife with her head cocked back and right hand clenched in the air above her chest. I jumped out of bed, flew to the light switch and turned it on. When I looked back, her frail, tiny body and fell completely limp and silent, eyes wide open. It was right then that I just knew I'd lost her. After all the pain, all the struggling, all the time in the hospital the previous year, this was it. This is fear. Stone cold fear. On Friday, April 4th, the previous year, we were on our way to the hospital to get her a kidney transplant. She was extremely nervous and had every right to be. It was scary, and after all, she was doing well on peritoneal dialysis, and she was otherwise very healthy. However, the thought of not doing dialysis was powerful enough she couldn't refuse. We get to the hospital and prep for surgery. Nothing was unusual about the surgery. Everything went well, and she was out in a matter of hours. We spent the next 3 to 4 days in the hospital, and when everything checked out, they released us. We had to stay nearby, of course, so we were staying at her father's place a few miles away. A couple days went by, and the very next Friday, 1 week from her surgery, we headed back to the hospital for her first checkup. Everything looked great. She was still very weak and tired, but nothing was unusual about that, so we headed back to her father's house. This is when the nightmare started. She began having some stomach pains on the way back, but nothing crazy. She thought she needed to go to the bathroom. She does her thing when we get there and she goes to lie down. It seemed like only a short period of time, maybe 30 minutes, and she was starting to bloat and feel extreme pain. We called the ambulance and soon, it seemed like hours, we were back at the hospital and she was being prepped for emergency surgery. There was a hole in her cecum. While in the emergency room, waiting for the surgery room to be prepped, the surgeon placed a tube in her stomach to release the pressure and try to ease her pain. It didn't work. She was suffering the entire time. Surgery took an eternity, at least 10 hours, and I was a wreck the entire time. I called back home to family and told them briefly what was going on, and not to worry or drive over until the next day. There was nothing to worry about. I lied. I didn't want them to risk driving in bad weather. When she came out, she went straight into ICU, where she stayed for at least a month, sedated, while she recovered from the infection. The transplanted kidney was gone. She spent an additional 2 months in the hospital before she was allowed to leave. I stayed with her the entire time. You see, I was in college when this all started and had to quit. There was no way I was going to finish with her in this situation. I'm a software developer and was getting a degree just to have that piece of paper, so I wasn't really concerned. I landed a small remote job and worked right from the hospital room. We were focused on recovery at this point. My job was over and I managed to get us into a program that paid the bills so I could stay home and help her recover. It was now September and we had just found out that her kidney had cancer on it and they wanted to remove it. Her surgery was scheduled at the end of the day, and when the doc asked, "Are you sure you're ready?" we should put it off. Hindsight is a female dog, and it seemed like he was tired in retrospect, but that's not what we did. She said she was ready, and 4 hours later, the doctor comes out of surgery and explains. When he was stapling the area where he had removed the kidney, he missed and stuck her inferior vena cava. Thankfully, a new vascular surgeon was just in his car when he got the call, so he was able to get back in quickly and save her life. She now had a graft around her IVC and again in ICU as she recovers. 1 week later, on the mark, we're at home and I'm changing a bandage on her exit site and notice pus. Great, just what we need. I call the surgeon and head over. She's taken straight into surgery where they flush everything out and find 2 holes in her intestines. Another bowel perforation. I'm not sure if you know this, but bowel perforations are extremely dangerous. They cause organ failure and often result in death. This is her second go with it. On top of the perforation and dealing with infection, she has this brand new graft around her IVC. Plastic. Plastic doesn't heal itself, so even if the rest of her body recovers from this new infection, what are we going to do about the graft? The new vascular surgeon was a graduate from OSHU and made the decision to send her there. She spends the next 2 months in ICU as they keep the exit site open and pack it in with gauze so they can go in and flush the site. Again, she's sedated the entire time, of course. When the time comes to decide what to do, they decided it was best not to perform more repairs and instead work on what they had and let the body recover. They place drain tubes in the intestine where the holes are and attach them to one of those hard plastic drain containers. Sorry, I don't remember the name. She leaves ICU and goes to a regular room. That night, her throat swells and she's unable to breathe. I'm woken in the middle of the night, and her nurse even seems to panic a little as she's calling for the emergency team. This was scary. At the time, it was the scariest moment I had ever experienced, but it didn't hold the crown for long. I don't recall the name of it, but it happens from time to time. When someone has had a tube in their throat as long as she had, it causes inflammation. She goes back to ICU for a while and recovers down there after the second tube removal to make sure she was good to go. A few months later, and some heavy training on how to take care of her, we were sent home. She was not allowed to eat solids for 1 year. She was on TPN nutrition that I supplied with a pump through her CVC, along with her new antibiotics and antifungal medication. They decided the risk of trying to repair the IVC was too great, so instead, she is to be on these new meds indefinitely, keeping any possible infections around the graft at bay. And then that dreadful night, light on, her body lying limp, no motion, no sign of life. For a moment, I was frozen, and thoughts of life without her were flooding my mind. No effing way. I turned and opened the door. Our kids were still living at home, so I started yelling, "Call 911!" and didn't stop. During this time, I went to her side and checked for a pulse, still yelling. Nothing. No pulse, no breathing. I start chest compressions. My kids were coming into the room by that time, and my oldest was on the phone with emergency. They mentioned the bed, so I picked her up and placed her on the floor and continued with chest compressions until the ambulance arrived and took over. After 3 shocks, she came to, looked around the room with the most curious expression. It turns out she's QT sensitive, and the combination of antibiotics and her Zoloft and others were just too much, sending her into torsades de pointe. She had her medications changed and watched carefully since then, and no other issues. We spent the rest of her recovery year trying to keep her away from solid foods, which I tell you is a pain in the ass. Can you imagine not eating solids for a full year? Neither could she. She pushed things a little, but luckily nothing ever plugged her lines. On the day of her final surgery, the surgeon scheduled, I believe he said 14 hours, but would take more if necessary. He wanted to just take it nice and slow and make sure nothing was missed and reduce any risks as much as possible. Less than 2 hours later, he comes to the waiting room with a huge smile. Both holes in the fistula had formed on the exit site were all within 12 inches of each other, and everything looked fantastic. A couple more weeks in the hospital, 1 week longer than typical, and we were on our way. This time for good. We signed up for a 5K next fall. I don't think we'll be running it, but we sure as hell will try. Sorry for such a long post. I didn't intend to go into as much detail as I did, but it's one of those stories that if you tell a piece of it, you end up telling more of it to explain. I wouldn't doubt if I missed anything.